In 2016, comic writer Ed Brubaker and artist Sean Phillips released the first issue of Kill or Be Killed. This story, like most of Brubaker's stories, play a lot with the expectations of how a character would behave compared to their actual actions. I believe Kill or Be Killed is a perfect example of this, as the character himself, Dylan, opens the book as its narrator and showcases his proficiency as a murderer, drawing the reader in only to quickly cut to a year prior, showing his inability to do anything in the face of adversity, save for a glare. He then switches it up once more with his attempted suicide before cutting to the first stable sequence of events with how he got to that moment. And from that moment, Dylan is largely chronological with his retelling of events that led to what we see in the last few pages, keeping the events that led to the opening pages secret until issue 6, where we finally understand the context behind the violence we witness, and the purpose of executing such an attack. Now that I've established the story and protagonist, my name is Character Studied, and today I'd like to analyse the protagonist and the events that lead him from being an average man to becoming a ruthless, Punisher-like vigilante, and explore whether his motives are intrinsic or extrinsic, and where the line for that shifts from the external coercion to self-justification. So, I'll start with the Demon. The Demon, wonderfully drawn by Phillips, first manifests after Dylan attempts to commit suicide. After surviving, Dylan returns to his apartment, shocked and exhausted, and attempts to sleep, only for a horned shadow demon to appear and explain that his survival, the second chance he has, comes with a price. In order for Dylan to keep living, he has to kill an evil person once a month. Dylan refuses, and the demon breaks his arm. This action leads to a bit of confusion later on, but it's also explained away by Dylan saying he must have broken his arm in the fall, and only realised it after the shock passed. But with the end of the month only a week away, Dylan caves in and kills a pedophile. And in this instance we see the first hint that the story we're being told isn't a perfectly concise story, as Dylan provides 4 possible things he said when he pulled the trigger, admitting that his memory isn't perfect, and that can change some of the events. The demon appears again in a beautifully drawn dream sequence in which Dylan sees the ski mask he buys later, along with the scarf and gloves to hide his identity. It's Dylan's second kill that leads to his next step in the world of vigilantism. But before I get to that, the story continues, and Dylan learns that the demon plagued his father as well, with the ghostly presence being littered through the man's explicit illustrations. This leads Dylan to fear the demon is merely a hallucination passed to him from his father, which is backed up by Kira's investigation into Dylan's psychological medicine being simple hallucinogenic pills given to him by his mobile drug dealer. By the time Dylan ends up in a psychiatric ward and is put on proper medication, the demon begins to fade from his mind, which makes it seem like a figment of his imagination, until the end of the book, which I'll get into later. But first, I want to talk about the force that shifted Dylan's self-preservation to a desire to fight criminals. The Russians. As I previously stated, Dylan's second kill, and to a lesser extent his third kill, lead to him being targeted by the Russian mob. Because Dylan blends in so well with New York's crowds, he isn't immediately found by the mob. Instead, his drug dealer Rex is, and he's tortured until Dylan sets up a meet with Rex. This scuffle with the Russian enforcer leads to the enforcer and Rex's death, but also leaves Dylan's masked persona public knowledge. This kicks the stakes of the story up as both the police and the Russians are hunting the masked man, with the Russians knowing Dylan's name. Because of Rex's death, however, Dylan is ready to give up and let the demon kill him, until the mob get Kira involved, with a scout going to her work and questioning other workers about her availability. This leads Dylan to take his first kill in months, and he begins to form a plan to take the leader of the mob down, whilst police detective Lily Sharp closes in on his identity. Dylan settles into his new happy life, dating his best friend Kira and having no qualms about his murdering ways. That is until he learns of a brother he never knew about who killed himself shortly after seeing his own hallucinations. The demon then manifests stronger than ever and leads to Dylan beating up his roommate, almost killing him by mistake until Kira knocks him out and has him admitted into a mental institution, where the mob, with the unknowing assistance of Lily, find him and make their last stand against him. But before I get into the conclusion of the novel and this video, I want to take a look at Dylan's unreliable narration. The unreliable narrator is a common concept in modern media. The concept that the story we're being told is entirely framed by the protagonist, and so certain events are obscured or muddied because of it. A major example is Fight Club, and the entire character of Tyler Durden. It is revealed towards the film's end that a lot of events that feature Tyler are all in the mind of the protagonist. This is a very common form of the unreliable narrator, but Dylan is an interesting case because he is the literal narrator, reflecting on the events of the book and where they left him at the narrative's conclusion. Now this is where I'm going to spoil the ending and how it plays into Dylan's character, so if I've invested you in the story and you're interested in picking it up, do not watch this section. Skip to this time code or just spin your laptop or phone the other way and mute it. Alright, 3, 2, 1. After the penultimate issue concludes and Dylan is lying on the ground, dying from one of the Russians' gunshots, he laments on how the sudden and shocking death comes out of left field and doesn't form a satisfying conclusion. So after 2 panels of nothing, he decides to give a better ending. One where he survives his wounds, moves in with Kira, denounces the existence of the demon, and resumes his life as a vigilante until the bitter end. Only to circle back around and reveal that he did in fact die outside the hospital that day. He also teases to the reader that he now understands what the afterlife is like, but he's not allowed to talk about it, save for the fact that it's not as good as living. The last thing he leaves the audience with is the idea that the world could be a good place, and that's all he wanted to say. But that's not where the story ends. Kira has one more conversation with Detective Sharp, who reveals the truth about Dylan being the man in the mask and how he died protecting her. The story then has a new narrator, Kira herself. And as she walks home in a daze, she thinks to herself about how awful the world can be, until she reaches her apartment and thinks about how someone should do something, before seeing the demon who terrorized Dylan. Her hair is also blue in this scene, as it was in her standalone chapter, What Kira Sees. And this leads me to think that Dylan's unreliable narration isn't restricted to dialogue or chronology of events, but to more simple things. If Kira had blue hair throughout the book, that'd be one thing, as would Dylan mentioning her being somebody who dyed her hair. But the fact that we see it as blue both times she's the focal point of the story exclusively outside of Dylan's narration seems like a damning factor that her red hair serves as a reinforcement to embrace Dylan's decision to wear the red mask of the vigilante and become a cold-blooded criminal killer. But if you've read the story or have a different interpretation of this small detail, feel free to leave a comment. I didn't know why I fell in love with this dark, depressing and insane look at what the consequences of a real-world vigilante would entail, but I did. And I think talking about the implications of the story, both from a contextual perspective and from a character standpoint, I've come to the conclusion that I love this story because of its very nature as a self-contained story of a man who loses hope before the story begins, but through his own dwindling sanity and his self-idealism through framing his own actions as progressively more right and heroic fascinates me. Not because I agree with Dylan's cynical and spiteful opinions regarding the world. No, I'm fascinated because it's a wild ride watching someone with such a loose grip on reality fight not only criminals, but his own self-doubt and fear of losing his grip on what's real. Thank you for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed, and a huge thank you to all the support on my last video. I was truly blown away, and it's encouraged me to try and get one of these videos out once a week. It's not an easy process to edit these, particularly with the comic videos where I'm sourcing and altering hundreds of pages, but the support and enjoyment you guys gain from it is a reward in of itself. With all that being said, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you're staying safe. Goodbye.